Hi, everyone. I'm Katharine, and I'm going to be the moderator for this keynote. And today we're going to be talking about divergent futures. And no matter where we fall on this issue, I think we've probably all spent a lot of time thinking about whether technology can save us or whether we need to completely rethink humanity's relationship to the economy, to the planet, and to one another within society. And so this is the kind of issue that we're going to be talking through today. And we have two very distinguished speakers, and I'm going to introduce the first, Ted Nordhaus, to you right now. So Ted Nordhaus is co-founder and executive director of the Breakthrough Institute, a global research center that identifies and promotes technological solutions to environmental and human development challenges. He's a leading global thinker on energy, environment, climate, human development, and politics. And over the last decade has helped lead a paradigm shift in climate, energy, and environmental policy. He's co-author of an Eco-modernist manifesto and Breakthrough, and is the executive director of the Breakthrough Journal. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here in Canada again. Been a few years. And really grateful that the Ecological Economic Society of Canada invited me to come. So if you follow debates between eco-modernists and degrowthers, you probably know that they often quickly dissolve. You know, if this discussion goes the way they often go, I'll call Giorgos a dirty hippie, he'll call me a techno-libertarian, and after that, it really doesn't matter what, no one will pay any attention to anything that either of us says. So I'm going to try not to do that. And I thought one thing that we try to practice at the Breakthrough Institute, a couple of things to try to sort of navigate these discussions in more fruitful ways, is sort of really two principles that we focus a lot on. The first we call achieving disagreement. And that we don't mean like, hey, everyone just get along. What we really mean by that is endeavoring to articulate the arguments of one's opponent in a manner that they would recognize as their own. So sort of try to avoid the straw man arguments and really do what some people call steel manning, make arguments and address your opponent's strongest arguments, not their weakest ones. And then the second is really just sort of practicing what we call epistemic humility, which is really two things. You know, first it's just explicitly recognizing the limits of your own knowledge and your own analytical and normative frameworks. And second, being capable of offering a well-formed critique of your own position. And in a bunch of our events, we actually explicitly ask people to do that, and I'm going to do that for you today. So really, there's three things I want to do today. I want to talk a little bit about sort of some of the kind of underlying foundational principles of eco-modernism. I want to address what I think are some of the tired criticisms of the eco-modernist project, and then also address and recognize what I think are we'll call them wired criticisms, things that certainly I take more seriously. And then I'm going to try to conclude with a bit of a synthesis. Some of the places where eco-modernism and degrowth might find some common ground. So let's start with what is eco-modernism. Actually, let me go back here. So, you know, I think, and this is really in the very first section of the Eco-modernist manifesto, I think this really gets at the concept, which is basically we argue that there's sort of two kind of principles that have really strongly underpinned environmental thought and action for many decades. And the first is that we need to shrink the human footprint so that we can leave more room for the rest of life on the planet. And the second is that we need to sort of get closer to nature. We need to sort of harmonize. We need to kind of get our societies and our economies more synced up with nature. And we basically argue that on a planet with 7 going on 9 billion people, you can't actually do both of those things. You have to choose. You can get closer to nature, you can shrink the footprint, you can't actually do both. So let me talk a little bit more about that first thing, which is sort of shrinking the footprint, and then I'll talk about sort of our relationship to nature. So there's really 3 principles or sort of 3 stools to the eco-modernist. There's 3 legs to the eco-modernist stool, and that's really energy, food, and cities. And sort of basically in all things, eco-modernists tend to kind of go, the way you shrink the footprint is you make the sort of you want sort of spatial activities that are smaller and denser, and you want higher productivity production systems that produce more with less, so greater efficiency. And so, when we think about energy, this is the reason when you want to know, like, why do eco-modernists tend to like nuclear energy? Well, we like it because it's really dense. So right here on the chart, this is total world land area used for energy production in 2010. Based on IEA projections of global energy use in 2050, this is what it will look like in 2050, given the sort of basically the current mix of energy production systems and fuels that we have. If we met that demand in 2050 instead entirely with nuclear energy, this is what the land footprint of the global energy system would look like. And if we attempted to meet it entirely with renewable energy, this is what it would look like. And this is actually based on Jacobson and DeLucci's work, which actually, for reasons that a lot of people are very skeptical of it, but they basically say they can do all of this without any biofuels, which are hugely land and resource intensive. So this is just wind, water, and solar, no biofuels. It's still a huge footprint if you use IEA's assumptions about energy consumption. And just for comparison's sake, if we actually end up with that future, it's almost as large as total U.S. Land area used for agriculture. That's crops, not crops and pasture. But that is, really the single largest human impact on the environment today. It's not actually climate change. It's global land use. So we like nuclear energy because it's dense. It's got a small footprint. We also, for the same reasons, like intensive agricultural systems. So this is from a report that the World Resources Institute put out just at the end of last year, looking at sort of basically all the things that you could conceivably do to try to keep emissions from global agriculture, to cut them to a level that would be consistent with stabilizing emissions at 450 ppm and keeping global temperatures under 2 degrees. And there's a lot of things in this chart. Just the one thing I would point, and the reason I show it, is about 2/3 of that actually comes from productivity improvements, basically yield gains. That's intensification, more food off of less land. And a lot of that is actually just assuming that we sustain yield improvements that we've seen over the last 40 or 50 years on an annual basis, which there's good reason to question whether we're actually going to be able to do that. But just when you start looking at sort of what it takes to get to meet global food demand in 2050 without huge increases in emissions, intensification becomes really, really important. And then finally, cities. This is the image of Hong Kong from the cover or from the website, the Eco-modernist manifesto website. Dense cities surrounded by nature. Cities are incredibly efficient in terms of land use, in terms of transportation issues. This is a chart put together by Our World in Data, looking at the relationship between sort of cities around the world and between population density and emissions. And obviously very, very strong relationship between very dense cities and lower transportation emissions, among other resources. So dense energy, intensive agriculture, and cities. That's really the eco-modernist, recipe, so to speak, and vision. Then let's talk a little bit about our relationship to nature and why it's, in our view, very difficult to both shrink the land footprint both shrink the human footprint and at the same time sort of reharmonize with nature. So this is a picture of the same valley from western Massachusetts in the late 19th century and in the early 21st century. Obviously the color picture is the present. Massive reforestation. We used to grow food in these places, and we don't anymore because our agricultural systems have become so much more productive. This is, and so there's really kind of two ways that we do that. The first is obviously intensification, just getting more from less. And the second is actually moving from sort of more natural, quote unquote, systems of provisioning to more artificial. So if you look at meat production, you go from bushmeat to pasture to feedlot, and maybe perhaps someday that's my own Impossible Burger that I made at home. But so moving from sort of more natural to less natural actually pretty consistently reduces the resource requirements of food production and all sorts of other production systems. So moving away from nature, not towards it, to spare nature. And then finally, this is another example of substitution, a different kind. Global consumption has shifted quite a bit over the last 4 or 5 decades from beef to poultry. So substituting here a much more resource-efficient source of protein for a much less resource-efficient. You get, interestingly, going from beef to poultry, you get as much, perhaps sometimes even a bit more if you're going to an industrially produced chicken from beef. You get as much greenhouse gas benefit from that switch as you do going from chicken to a vegan diet. And again, long-term cropland per capita declining very significantly, and pasture land per capita already declining very significantly. And we really look at these things and say, these are the trends that we need to sort of swim. These are basically modernization trends, and we need to swim with the stream of sort of these modernization processes and not attempt to swim against them. What else do I have here? So, I think there's really sort of a couple of big trends that we, when we look at those trends, and the things that actually give us sort of some optimism for the future. The first is falling fertility rates, long-term consistent decline in fertility, and you get various arguments about when and where exactly that's going to peak and then potentially decline. But it's sort of pretty clear looking at sort of what's happening with fertility globally that is moving in a positive direction in terms of impacts on the environment. Again, we're in the most rapid process of urbanization in human history right now, so people all over the world sort of leaving the land, leaving rural, agrarian, social, and economic contexts and moving into cities. Also even, when we're seeing big increases in resource consumption in the developing world. But in developed economies, we started to see a lot of those trends flatten. So this is meat consumption trends around the world. And even North America, where we consume a huge amount of meat, you see that's actually kind of flattened out and stayed fairly consistent for about the last 2 decades. So let me talk about what I think that's the basic eco-modernist perspective. Let me talk about what I think are sort of a set of the sort of tired criticisms and why I think they're sort of not particularly helpful. And then I want to kind of get to what I think are sort of more serious criticisms. So here, the 3 things that we hear a lot. 1, there's just no absolute decoupling, can't happen, impossible, capitalism won't allow it, capitalist economies are just sort of, they can't survive without constantly increasing, exponential growth with exponential long-term increases in resource consumption. The second is that eco-modernists want everyone to live in big artificial bubbles. We're the bubble people. Everyone's going to kind of be completely detached from nature in this eco-modernist dystopia. And the third is that eco-modernism is apolitical. There's no politics here. It's totally technocratic. So let me address each of those in kind. So, frankly, the sort of claim that this is just completely a fantasy because there's been no absolute decoupling of resources globally in anywhere. It's just, it's incorrect. You can look at things like pasture land. There are actually a number of pretty important resource uses that over the last several decades have decoupled. But even were that not the case, I just think that sort of trying to draw any conclusions about the prospects for absolute decoupling over the course of the last 4 or 5 decades, where population has been growing massively and massive populations of people have been moving from agrarian poverty to something that looked like modern lives, is just, there's no amount of decoupling that could overcome that in the short term until those population trends start to slow and until sort of growth rates start to slow. And in fact, that's what's happening. As I pointed out before, fertility rates are falling, world population growth rate is falling, and sometime in the middle of the century, most demographers expect that global population is going to peak. So one of the things in that IPAT equation that has been driving increasing resource use is not going to be a driver of that any longer. Similarly, economic growth isn't going negative anytime soon, but if you looked at developed economies, the growth rate of developed economies has slowed substantially. And that's really because you just get huge, very substantial growth rates in the early stages of industrialization as large populations are moving from very low consumption agrarian living arrangements to modern urban living arrangements. But then you just can't sustain those growth rates for long. So, you can get a couple of decades of 8-10% growth, and then that's going to kind of generally drop to 3, 4, 5% growth. And today, most developed economies are struggling to maintain 2% growth over the long term. I think there's good reason to think that those growth rates are going to asymptote towards 0 over the long term. And finally, in developed economies, we actually have seen evidence of absolute decoupling. This is work done by Jesse Ausubel, who is really one of the sort of fathers of decoupling research. He looked at use of 9 metals in the US economy from 1900 basically through 2010. And what he finds is that those growth rates in terms of the amount of inputs really start to flatten out after about Earth Day 1970. And in the 1990s and then into the 2000s, almost all of them start to decline in absolute. So there's absolute peak consumption of resources in the US economy already happening. So again, this sort of no such thing, absolute decoupling is impossible. I don't think there's a strong argument for that. the sort of we want to put everyone in a bubble. Well, no, actually, we want to reduce human dependence on material dependence on nature, but that allows for actually a lot more nature around us. And this is actually a graphic that my friend Emma Maris put together. She wrote a piece called Interwoven Decoupling, where she actually argued that you could have absolutely imagine futures where you had very, very dense, intensive, efficient production systems for agriculture, energy, various other things. And at the same time, you had nature all around, coming in and out of cities with corridors and even small farms so that people could have an experience with the production of food, even if that's not where most of our food came from. And this is the kind of vision for sort of the human experience of nature that I certainly, as an eco-modernist, hold. And finally, there's this thing that, well, eco-modernism is this sort of apolitical, technocratic kind of enterprise. I said, okay, well, let me go and look up the definition of politics. And obviously, to be political can mean many things. And as best I can tell, there's only actually one way in which that claim is being made, and I think it's 3A, competition between competing interest groups or individuals for power and leadership. So I think this is actually what the criticism of eco-modernism as apolitical is really all about. It's this particular understanding and use of politics. And I think it's not even that particular. It's not even that broad. I think it's, what I actually believe that criticism is a criticism that eco-modernism doesn't have a sweeping politics that is either class-based or anti-extractivist. And I think that's true. My view is that all politics is local, and that in different contexts, in different places, the power relationships are going to be different. The sort of stakeholders on different sides of these decisions are going to be different. The winners and losers are going to look different. So I would argue as an eco-modernist that yes, we actually have a more sort of pragmatic and localized view of politics as opposed to sort of insisting that you can fit all conflict and all sort of political conflict around environmental resource decisions into this very sort of singular framework for politics and power. So now let me move to what I think are stronger criticisms of eco-modernism. So the first is that decoupling and dematerialization might happen. They might be happening, but they're not happening fast enough. And I think if you, for instance, are believe that climate change is like an asteroid acting on the planet, and basically the likelihood of human civilizations surviving if we don't limit global increase due to climate change to 1.5 degrees. Yeah, decoupling and dematerialization is not going to stabilize global temperatures at 1.5 degrees. I'll tell you that absolutely. I don't think it's even going to do it at 2. But I don't think there's any other plausible framework that can do that either. You can put a spreadsheet together and we could start building, we could decide that climate change was like an asteroid and we could nationalize economies all over the world and start building nuclear power plants, all sorts of other things to hit those targets. But we're not going to do that, and I don't think we're going to decide to massively scale back economies around the world either to sort of stay within these temperature targets or various other planetary boundaries that people have proposed. And my view is that lower emissions are better than higher emissions, lower impact is better than higher impact. You need to go as fast as you can, and we're probably not going to go as fast as a lot of people would like. The sort of second issue is that you can have a lot of decoupling and not necessarily get the outcomes that you want. To go back to our picture of that pretty second growth forest in western Massachusetts, that's real nice, but if what you get through decoupling is a lot of that sort of forest coming back, and you're losing a lot of primary tropical forest around the world. Both from a climate perspective and from a biodiversity perspective, that's a pretty bad trade-off. Decoupling does require you have to do land use planning, you have to do conservation. We would argue that decoupling makes those things much easier because it reduces the pressure on the resources and on the land. But decoupling alone isn't going to preserve all the biodiversity that we'd want to preserve. We have to decide that we want to preserve it. Finally, there are even if in the long term, most people benefit from processes like urbanization. In the short term, there's a lot of dislocation. It's hard. It's not easy. So I think some people, including some of my colleagues, will sort of just wave their hands and say it's going to be this sort of wonderful and everyone's going to live in cities and how great it's going to be. But the journey from sort of rural life to the city is really, really hard, even if you don't, as I don't, see it all as sort of a history of enclosure, which I don't believe is actually the story around agricultural modernization. But it's certainly been part of the story. All, I think, serious challenges to eco-modernism, as opposed to, I think, some of the not-so-serious challenges I started with. Finally, let me talk a little bit about where I think there's room for agreement between eco-modernists and degrowth advocates. So the first is that we all actually, both camps actually really do agree and focus on a desire to really shrink the human footprint, to leave more room for the rest of life. And I think it's not degrowthers tend to focus on less economic activity. Eco-modernists tend to focus on technological change. I think it's worth asking whether there are visions that can bring both of those things together: low-growth economies and with a lot of technological change. Second, I think both degrowthers and eco-modernists actually sort of share some similar ideas about what I call post-materialism, which in some contexts is a controversial term, but I use it here to very simply sort of note that there is sort of some point at which more material consumption doesn't necessarily create much more utility or welfare for most people. And when you look at these trends that show sort of saturating consumption of various resources and things, I think that's good evidence that there's some point at which people decide enough is enough. Even in the United States, where we have a terrible obesity problem, most people will have a hard time consuming more than about 3,000 calories a day. After that, it's just people are done. And sometimes they consume, various sorts of proteins, things like that are problematic. But there is some point at which demand saturates. Again, I think eco-modernists and degrowthers may have different ideas about practically where that level is or where it can be established. But I do think that there's sort of some shared vision there. And then finally, what I'll call regrounding, which I would define as sort of once people kind of have liberated themselves from agrarian poverty, gone through these various modernization processes, living in prosperous economies, a lot of people decide they'd like to get back closer to nature. They'd like to grow some of their own food. They'd like to, go back to sort of lower productivity types of production and services as opposed to very commodified industrial produced goods and services. And then, not just to leave you with, okay, it's all good, we can all get along here, just to suggest some of the challenges in that synthesis. So, I think it's worth thinking about what low growth, high-tech societies might look like, I think it is also true, generally, that technological change happens faster with higher growth. You just have faster turnover of capital stock. You have more prosperous societies that often are willing to pay more for various amenities. There's a bunch of reasons why technological change in these contexts accelerates, and lower growth, I think, potentially there are trade-offs between growth rates and technological change. When we talk about, that there is such a thing as enough, I think there's also the question of enough for whom and at what level and who decides that. Is it volitional? Are some group of people going to decide how much the average American or Canadian gets to drive or consume or otherwise do these things, and how does that happen in a democratic context? And finally, I would argue that volitional shift among some late modern elites towards less commodified, lower productivity goods and services actually is predicated upon and really requires the economic surplus and just the sort of underlying materiality that is produced by commodified, high productivity industrial modernity. So I'm not sure that a bunch of that volitional sort of voluntary simplicity, preference for lower productivity labor, goods and services, things like that, is actually an alternative to commodified, globalized industrial production, but rather I think sort of in a lot of cases is sort of a froth that sort of floats on top of it. So I'm very much looking forward to Giorgos's remarks and to the discussion afterwards. Thank you all very much for having me.
Thanks so much for your presentation. And now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Giorgos Kallis. He's an environmental scientist working on ecological economics and political ecology at the University of Barcelona. He's motivated by a quest to cross conceptual divides between the social and the natural domains, and is interested in the political economic roots of environmental degradation and its uneven distribution along lines of power, income, and class. Currently, he's one of the leading voices exploring the hypothesis of a sustainable degrowth, defined as a smooth economic downscaling to a sustainable future where we can live better with less. Welcome.
Can you confirm that you can hear me and see my PowerPoint? Yes. Okay, good. Okay, shout like that, and if I say something funny, laugh, because right now I'm talking in front of my PowerPoint. So it's really difficult to know what reaction my presentation is having. So thanks for inviting me, and hello from Barcelona, as we say here in the Eurovision contest. I'm going to talk a little bit over Ted's presentation, in the sense that I'm not going to address ecomodernism here. I want to make the case for degrowth the way I would make it if it was presented alone. And I think then in the extra time, not the extra time of our game, I would say, of our football game, I can engage a little bit more with Ted's presentation and the differences between the two visions. Let me start by saying that I take very seriously what Ted said about epistemic humility. So my presentation here, I think, is more about the diagnosis rather than the prognosis. So I want to share with you a little bit the diagnosis that I make on my book about degrowth. What is wrong with this dominant and obsessive idea that we have in societies right now, which is the pursuit of economic growth. So I want to make the diagnosis of what is wrong with that and where is it coming from, and only to a lesser extent try to make the big picture vision of what should change. Because to be honest, I don't think that me or anyone alone or any intellectual can really say what should change and have these big vision pictures about how we can move people from one place to the other or what technologies to implement, etc. I think it's important to put these ideas down on the table, as Ted does, and stimulate debate. But I see, as an ecological economist, less my role to do that and more to explain or to give a different narrative of how the current system works and what is wrong with it. So let me start by a quote that many of you ecological economists in the room would be familiar with, because it is from one of the first ecological economists, Kenneth Boulding, who wrote that back in 1966 on his famous essay, The Economics of Coming Spaceship Earth. And Kenneth Boulding wrote, anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And I think being an economist, Kenneth Boulding, and having this haircut was a little bit of a bold statement to make, no, about madmen. But I would say that I fully agree with this statement, and I would go one step further. I would say that anyone who believes in exponential growth can go on forever, even if we take out the question of whether the world is finite and to what extent is finite and which resources are finite or are not finite, which is a debate that we spend a lot of time unnecessary, I think, in the 90s, 70s. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever is either a madman or an economist. You would know about you would have heard probably other times about the problems and the madness of exponential growth, right? According to an old story, the inventor of the game of chess was offered a reward by a delighted king. He requested just a modest sounding payment. He said, like, just give me 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard and 2 on the second from the king, 4 on the third, doubling its time. And you will know, if you know a little bit of mathematics, that this quickly explodes towards infinity. By the 40th square, the inventor would need to be given by the king the whole rice produced in the world right now. And by the last square of the chess, he would need a crazy number of 18 quintillions, which I didn't even know that this word exists, 18 billion billions of grain of rice. We use this example very often to make clear that this idea of exponential growth, of something that might seem innocuous or innocent, like a 3% growth per year, no? Which is what President Trump promised in the US, which is what the EU wants to reach, which is all the goals of economic policy of the IMF are considering as a reasonable, healthy rate of growth. That 3% per year means basically doubling the size of the economy every 24 years or so, like every 24 years or so, passing from one square to the next and to the next and to the next, towards an infinitesimal expansion of the economy that I would say is both unreasonable and, in a sense, absurd. So what I want to argue today is not so much that there are ecological limits to growth, that there are, of course, not only that economic growth is catastrophic, but that this idea of economic growth is in one sense mad, as Kenneth Boulding said back in 1966, and absurd. It doesn't have any sense. Ted kind of toned it down and talked about 2% growth, but 2% growth, which sounds low growth, still it's infinite. It's compound growth that very quickly turns into infinity. 2% growth means that the economy doubles every 35 years or so instead of every 24 years with 3%. In How Much is Enough, Robert Skidelsky and Edward Skidelsky made precisely this critique to growth. And it's a critique that I would very much encourage you to read. They said that the pursuit of money or of growth as an end in itself is bad, not just because it is detrimental to the happiness or the environment, but just because it is absurd. Our deeper objection to endless growth, they concluded, is that it is senseless. Money is essentially a means to the good. To treat its accumulation as the ultimate goal is to fall victim to delusion. Their critique, and Robert Skidelsky is a Keynesian economist, and Edward Skidelsky is a philosopher. His son is a philosopher of Aristotelian tradition. It's coming directly from the thought of both these thinkers, Keynes and Aristotle. And Aristotle, first and very early on, when money was invented, at the first, let's say, periods of the invention of money and its widespread use in Greece, argued that while there is a limit on how much we can eat, and Ted used this example of how many calories can one eat, of course there is a limit to that, there is no limit to how much money and power one may accumulate. If you think why the inventor of chess might have asked for that rice from the king, of course he could never eat this exponential growing quantity of rice, but he asked for it precisely to exchange it with money and with it to exchange it for power. That's the logic of accumulation, and that's the logic behind growth. The difference, Aristotle argued, is that while there is a limit of how much we can eat, there is a limit of how many houses we can have, there is a limit of how many shoes we can have, unless we are Imelda Marcos, there is no limit to how much money and power we may accumulate. This pursuit of money, Skidelsky and Skidelsky argue, writ large, the pursuit of growth has displaced the search for meaning and the search for the good life in our society. So it has, in the absence of meaning and in the absence of any sense of what is the goal of our society, it's a society which its goal is to maintain growth for growth's sake. And this is precisely the logic of this society, because this is the logic of capitalism. It's the logic of each individual capitalist. In order to survive and not lose to competition, you have every year to grow. You either have to grow or die. This logic, writ large, is the logic of our society. And it's this precisely logic that is problematic. David Harvey, in his books Enigma of Capital and the 17th Contradictions of Capitalism, calls the demand for compound growth a bad infinity. This is a diagram of how much the economy would have to grow by the end of the century. Look at that, because I think we don't realize what we're talking about when we talk about an innocent 3% growth rate per year, which is actually most of the assumptions and growth rates included in the IPCC report, including the IPCC scenarios. So 3% growth per year, which means a doubling of the economy every 20 or 25 years or so, will lead to this increase that you see there by 2100. David Harvey writes this. He says, think of it this way. When capitalism was made up of activity within a 50-mile radius around Manchester and Birmingham in England and a few other hotspots in 1750, then seemingly endless capital accumulation at a compound rate of 3% posed no big problem. But right now, think of endless compound growth in relation not only to everything that is going on in North America, Oceania, and Europe, but also East and Southeast Asia, as well as much of India and the Middle East, Latin America, and significant areas of Africa. The task of keeping capitalism going at this compound rate is nothing if not daunting. And I would say it's not just daunting, it is absurd. It is absurd, and at the pursuit of this absurd rate that capital needs in order to reproduce itself, it's the core of all the malaise, the economic malaise that we are experiencing now. And I will pass to the ecological very soon. But we are printing more and more money just to keep the economy growing. That graph shows just the growth of debt. And this is like, despite all the austerity policies that have been implemented in the public sector, but debt is growing, debt of the financial sector and debt of households. In the name of growth and in the constant pursuit of capital to make more profit, we see bubbles created in basic goods that become more and more affordable. So we hear from Ted like lofty visions about putting people to cities. Right now, you cannot live in a city. Like I struggle as a professor to pay the rent to live in a city like Barcelona. Why is that? It is because there is excess capital that wants to make a profit at a 2 or 3% rate from all over the world, that it's coming and it's being invested to buy houses and renting them in Barcelona, and rents keep going up. In the name of maintaining this 2 or 3% growth per rate, we have cuts in social and environmental protections to pay off public debt and sustain growth. opening of new areas for mining in the US, including a retreat of protected areas and environmental gains that we had in the 1970s. Mining, investment in mining and fossil fuels and in food commodities all over the world, driving their prices up. Again, in the pursuit of making more money out of money. The environmental impacts, I don't think I have to tell you much about them, but we know that the environmental impacts in this century have grown exponentially and hand in hand with GDP and population. We are talking about everything here: primary energy use, water use, fertilizers, paper, vehicles, large dams. I mean, you name it, carbon dioxide, you name it, and it's there. And it's the same exact trend. The trends that Ted referred to, like urbanization, intensive agricultural production, dense energy production, these are part of these trends. These are, I would say, part and parcel of these trends. By producing things more intensively and more efficiently, we have been growing the economy. By producing energy more densely with fossil fuels instead of than biofuels, or instead of just solar energy before, we are accelerating the economy and accelerating resource use and environmental damage. By concentrating people in cities, we are not consuming less, we are consuming more. The footprint of cities keep expanding. By having more intensive agriculture, the inputs that go to maintain this agriculture, from energy to other resources, keep increasing. And that's the general picture that I don't think can be denied. Of course, someone can imagine a very different future, and we can be both scientists and novelists imagining very different future, but the trends and the structural relations and the structural pattern of growth, which is productivity, in order to produce more surpluses, to invest them, to produce even more and create more profits along the way, that's the basic logic. So by arguing that by making the economy even more productive, we are going to somehow completely change these patterns and turn these graphs upside down, I think it's very unlikely. It's not just a matter, of course, of trends over time. It's also like cross-data analysis that shows that the wealthier a country is, the more it pollutes the environment. I'm talking about crucial pollutants here, because we know that for some very specific pollutants that can be easily substituted or sent outside, like sulfur, etc., there is the so-called environmental Kuznets curve. So the richer a country gets, the less it pollutes the environment. But if we see a resource use of the basic resources, if we see carbon emissions, etc., we know that the wealthier countries damage the environment much more than the less wealthy countries, and there is no inflection point yet. Let's say also that for carbon dioxide, it's really surprising that this is the case, because there's no direct relation necessarily between an economy and emitting more carbon. I mean, compared to resource use, where there is a very tight link, at least for carbon emissions, one would expect to see perhaps some stronger decoupling than what we've seen up to now. And up to now, after so many years of trying different policies, promoting renewables, having nuclear energy since the 1950s and 60s, and supposedly very soon becoming too cheap to meter. With all these developments of supposedly energy alternatives, we see like a very close coupling and connection between the output of the economy and its carbon emissions. Is green growth possible? I just published a paper with Jason Hickel where we argued precisely that if we study the existing models, the best models that scientists have made, green growth of decoupling resource use from economic output is very, very highly unlikely. If we look at carbon emissions, it's and I think Ted considered that, I mean, he accepted that, is almost impossible to decouple at a rate that would be necessary to keep us within 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And then we conclude with that green growth is likely to be a misguided objective. And it's an objective that the OECD, the World Bank, everyone around keeps hammering, that we still need growth in our part of the world I'm talking about, in the OECD also. We need growth, but we have to make it greener. Where do we base it on analysis? We look at different models that predict resource use. And even in the best case scenario of intense technological substitution, high taxes, energy taxes and resource taxes, as much decoupling as possibly or technically predictable, with the levels of growth that we aspire to and probably we can achieve in the short in the short time, resource use is going to double or be a little bit less than that by 2050. In terms of carbon emissions, the only IPCC model that is compatible with 1.5 degrees Celsius is one that actually postulates a drastic reduction of or the growth of energy use. All the other scenarios rest on untested negative emission technologies that do not exist yet to just square up the numbers. In our research with Dan O'Neill that it's going to be published soon, we reassert the fact that what matters the most in carbon emissions is scale. That doesn't mean that we have, of course, to zero the economy in order to zero the emissions, but it's just a plain recognition that the most important factor is scale. The black line is carbon emissions, historical carbon emissions up to now. The green lines are carbon emissions. What would it have been if we didn't have any renewable energy installed up to now? The upper green line is if we didn't even have nuclear power until now, and all the energy we have produced for non-fossil fuels was produced by fossil fuels. Very small difference these alternative sources of energy have done up to now. The red and the blue lines are two different estimations of how much carbon emissions we would have had up to now if we didn't have any recession. If the goal of every economist and of every nation to not have negative growth at any year was achieved, that's what carbon emissions would look like, 25% higher at the cumulative emissions than what they are right now. And this is from a paper that we are also developing now with my student Aljosa Slamersak, which is basically a study of how much energy would have to be spent in order to make a transition to clean energy. The yellow columns show for different IPCC scenarios how much of the energy, how much of the carbon emissions would have to be spent just for making a transition. Our conclusion is, of course, obvious, but supported here with numbers, that the smaller the energy system will have to decarbonize, the less extra emissions we're going to emit along the process of doing that. So even a 0% growth, yes, would be very welcome, because the economy wouldn't double within the next 25 years, which is a huge thing if we are thinking about carbon emissions. Now, about the weightless economy, Ted showed very selective data about selective materials, but if we see the world as a whole and we take material flows, we see that the pattern is actually one of increasing global material flows. The last 10 years actually increasing even faster than GDP. I don't know how to call that. It's not relatively coupling. Absolute decoupling is coupling in the square. If we look then at countries like the US, but we take material footprint, not domestic materials, what is consumed within the borders of the country, but material footprint, which is the green line, and shows the material embedded in all the products and services that the Americans use. Again, we see that this grows line in line with GDP, which is the blue line. Oof, I see that my time is flying and I have like 5 minutes left. I would like to say that growth is not necessary. Western countries, we could say, are overdeveloped. Further growth that does not bring us closer to the good life. And you have seen probably a lot of these figures, but Costa Rica achieves the life expectancy of the US, the same life expectancy at 1/5 of the output of the US. Costa Rica has the same, and I'm referring to Costa Rica, but you see there are more countries along close to Costa Rica. Costa Rica achieves the same level of personal well-being as the US, again, at 1/5 of GDP per capita. And if we see also over time, the number of people who report in the US that they are happy with their lives or content with their lives, we see that the dramatic growth of output and of carbon emissions that has taken place since 1972 has not made a difference in the satisfaction of people with their lives. Is growth necessary? And here I think there is a strong argument that growth might be necessary for eliminating poverty, right? If we see data about poverty, we see that the number of people who are relatively poor, that means poor compared to the level of poverty as defined in their country, is actually increasing, is not decreasing. The number of absolutely poor people is decreasing, and one might say that growth is doing a good job in that, but it's decreasing only if we define poverty at the $1.9 per day level. If we defined it at the $5 level, which is a level that many scientists have argued is also reasonable, we don't see any noticeable change. Let me also point to the fact that, of course, the number of absolutely poor people and the income is increasing because these numbers are drawn exactly by extrapolating from GDP per capita in countries and then income distribution. So it's not surprising to see that the number of absolutely poor people is decreasing. But the question is, like, to what extent would we need the global economy to keep growing in order to alleviate poverty? And the numbers become absurdly high if we were to think that just by increasing the overall output, the number of, we're gonna reduce the number of poor. Just to show you, like, a back of the envelope calculation, a ridiculous, I would say, back of the envelope calculation, but shows that at the rate at which GDP right now reduces the number of people below who live with less than $5 per day, we would have to increase global GDP 170 times its present size, so that no one lives with less than $5 per day. I mean, this is a ridiculous number and it doesn't mean anything, but what it shows is that there is no substitute, real substitute to redistribution if we are to seriously think about reducing the number of people who are poor in this world. And especially if we start thinking about terms of relative poverty, which I think are much more important because it makes little sense to claim that the person who lives in the US and by Madagascar's standards would be a middle class is not poor in the US. Of course, he's poor in the US, and there are different lines of poverty in each country. It's also, I think, a little bit ironic that people who defend the economic growth would defend it in the name of we have to keep growing in the north so as to eliminate poverty in the global south. Because if one sees the history of economic growth in the north, to a large extent, it has been based on cheap surpluses of resources and people exploited in the global south. So in one sense, I agree with Ted and the eco-modernist vision that the south has to develop, but in its own terms, and it has to develop autonomously. But the pattern of development of the south, if what we want to do is to export the current pattern, unsustainable pattern of development of the north in the south, this is only to an extent to maintain for us cheap resources and cheap labor. And development in the south, if it is to be sustainable and ecologically sustainable for the planet as a whole, in the sense if it is to take place without regressing to what we are regressing right now, which is geopolitical rivalry and rich countries trying to close the doors and keep as much of the resources as possible. If it is to take place, it will have to be a different model of development, a model of development that it is born from the south, but has a different dimension, a qualitative dimension, and doesn't follow the same catastrophic and obsessed with growth path that it has followed on the north. So what would be the growth in that sense? So the growth, first, I would emphasize three elements of the growth. The first is to abolish this mad and senseless pursuit of economic growth. I mean, if we agree that economic growth is a problem, and if Ted or other eco-modernists agree that economic growth is a problem and that it's good that 0% growth might be coming, then we should be vocal about it. Whoever believes in that should be really vocal about it, because there is a tide of political discourse and of civil culture that will demand growth and keeps demanding growth and elects leaders who promise growth to be confronted. So if we think that growth is not necessary, it is important to try to change the political discourse. This is not, I'm not talking here about just changing the indicator, changing GDP. This is like changing the speed meter in your car and thinking that this way you're gonna change the speed. I'm talking about changing the speed and not caring about the speed of the car. The point here is that this idea of growth has to be derooted, taken out of its roots of both policy objectives and the way we come to think about also our everyday lives and our societies. And I don't see this happening by underplaying the importance of this factor in the overall transition. The second would be to manage without growth, because even if it was true, and I doubt that it's true that natural economies, richer economies are coming to a stagnation level. I think, of course, there are economies that they are stagnating right now, but in these economies, there is obsession again with relaunching growth, and there are social cuts, environmental cuts, all in the name of trying to maintain the profit rate and relaunching growth. And I think US is an excellent example. And it's actually not a confirmation that there is a natural stagnation. The US grows 3% this year with all the terrible policies that we know. So if we are to manage without growth and prove that we can manage without growth, we need new economic policies, and we need new social structures and new economic structures at the ground level to support these policies. In the letter that we published with 238 other academics here for the European Parliament, for a meeting we held at the European Parliament, we listed a number of these policies that can make a difference. I cannot say that there are recipes, and I won't say that they are fixes and that this can solve the problem or create a society where we can manage without growth. But we have at least to start thinking along these lines, start talking about gradual reduction in working time, start talking about progressive taxation and limits. Yes, limits, legislative limits on resource use, that they were what worked best for environmental protection, but we have completely given up on them. We have to think about a basic and a maximum income. And here it's my partial agreement with Ted that he also put in his slide, that we need, of course, to clean resource and energy supply and energy use, but I would emphasize we need also to reduce it. It's not just a matter of adding new resources and new technologies on top of what we already have, because what he called substitution, to a large extent, is that. It's not true that renewables or nuclear energy have substituted fossil fuels. What has happened is that these energy sources have added even more energy in the system on top of fossil fuels. So if we really want to take fossil fuels out of the mix, we need to have specific policies and agreements to limit the use of fossil fuels. There is no alternative to that. Just by becoming more and more efficient or using alternative technologies, we are just accelerating the economy and adding more and more technologies to the mix. But we are not really taking out what is the problem. So clean the supply, and of course, technological development and massive investment in renewable energies like right now along the lines of what is called the Green New Deal is absolutely essential, but along with policies of limits. Efficiency makes sense only if there is a limit. If there is no limit, we are just reproducing the standard process of accumulation, which is becoming more efficient and producing more and more. Is degrowth possible? And this is my last slide, and I will leave it here. It's the last chapter that I have on my books, in my book, where I am quite frank that degrowth might not be politically possible. So I'm not going to be like a cloud walking utopian here, and I'm definitely not a hippie. I was a big fan of Bruce Springsteen. I don't know what this makes me, but definitely not a hippie. There are many problems with a degrowth proposal. Can we maintain a massive investment without growth? I think we can, with political willingness to reallocate resources, financial resources, but there is a problem of maintaining massive investment without growth. Of course, massive investment with growth is like running after your own tail, no? Because growth increases resource use, and then you invest in cleaning up some part of the resource use, which is what we've been doing up to now, relative decoupling, or at best, some stabilization of resource use. But to reverse these trends, we would need to both invest massively on clean technologies and at the same time reduce use. And how to reduce use, that's the tricky part. Can we reduce resource use at a much lower level than it's necessary? And I'm thinking about our own part of the world. We're talking about a resource use that would be 20 or 30% of what it is now, and maintain well-being. This is an important research question, and I don't think it can be answered by saying, oh, your income is going to be 1/5 of what it is now. If we take it this way, of course, I couldn't live with 1/5 of my income. But what if housing was public, for example, and I didn't have to pay the exorbitant rent I pay now? What if all the bullshit jobs, as David Graeber calls them, and bullshit products that we produce and consume in our society were cut, and instead these resources, we use them to liberate time, free time, or we use them to invest in the things that need investing? Could it be possible that we could achieve some well-being with much lower resource use? Now, questions of how do we do this globally, and how do we mediate such transition between North and South, and how do we do that in a context of geopolitical competition and geoeconomic competition and the rise of fascist forces around the world, of course, brings us to a very different terrain. And I would like to discuss that when we discuss the politics of the two visions after. I think with whatever sustainability vision we have right now, its politics are next to almost impossible. But politics, the trick with politics is that nothing is impossible in politics. Because if we lived in the feudal era and we were thinking about overthrowing the kings, it would seem impossible. So then we would think, how can we manage things while we keep our kings around? But overthrowing the kings was necessary for the developments that took place. Same for slavery. And the tricky thing, the important thing, I think, with political change is it happens very fast, and it happens with sparks and in moments that no one expects them to happen. So, as a scholar that I write about these things, I see my responsibility first of seeing the situation and trying to portray it as true as it is possible, and then keeping some optimism. And I think this is what makes the degrowth vision a very optimistic vision about the future, keeping some optimism that we can get our act together and we can bring the necessary political change to change this catastrophic capitalist system, which is based on an idea that it's pure madness, the idea of perpetual economic growth. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, okay, my mic is on now. All right. Hello. Thanks, Giorgos. It's going to be a little bit awkward because I can't actually look at you. I have to turn around, but that's okay. So just a reminder about the questions. I'm not sure, where's VJ? Do you want to? Here he is. So you can give your questions to VJ or you can use the hashtag. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start with this question, and if this is your question, we may need clarification. Hopefully I will do it justice. So your vision is very Western European centered in terms of its understanding of human-nature relations. It's a one-world world, as anthropologist and political ecologist Arturo Escobar would claim. It is the same singular vision that has led to the violence justifying colonial conquest of racialized bodies and women since the age of exploration. In essence, it reinforces white supremacy and a patriarchal domination of man over non-human. And so I believe...
Doesn't sound like there's a question.
Yeah. Is there a question there? Does whoever wrote that want to have a little comment? No? Okay. Okay. Okay, so we're hoping just to have a response from the speakers. Okay. Ted, do you have anything to say about that?
You know, when did I stop beating my wife? You know, I think these kinds of, I mean, it's the kind of rhetoric that I think actually, you know, is really good for kind of having arguments in places like this that don't actually have much impact on anything in the world. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I appreciate Giorgios's recognition of sort of some of the political challenges with even, you know, even in, you know, where, you know, I think Giorgios makes some very interesting arguments, and, you know, and then we get to the end of it, and it's like a carbon tax. So, you know, I guess my kind of question back is like, until you can tell me what these alternative institutions look like, how they operate at scale, what sort of actual kind of conceivable policy agenda, might be, sort of put in place in some sort of democratic fashion. It's just talk and sort of white supremacy, and you just get escalating rhetoric, and it's actually pretty disconnected from anything that happens in the world. I think, if anything, in the developed world, what we're seeing is actually pretty problematic reactions, I think, to a bunch of that. If you look at the sort of rise of right-wing populism, a lot of it has sort of positioned itself, quite explicitly oppositionally in relationship to the kind of rhetoric and frames and claims about the world that are coming out of discussion, conferences like this, honestly. I think anyone who is sort of a reasonably well-educated person working in this field, to some degree, is living in a particular kind of bubble that I think we need to pay some attention to. So that's all. I mean, I'm not going to get into arguments about one world versus two world, and it just doesn't. I don't think it's really particularly useful to engage even.
Right. Okay. Giorgos, do you have anything to add, or even to respond to Ted's question, which was embedded within the response, about the kinds of specific policy spaces that you might be imagining for a degrowth future?
Yeah, I have specific policies, and I've written them. But I've written about them, and I emphasize policies. But when we talk about something so fundamental, which is changing and the institutions of something that is so fundamental right now, which is the pursuit of economic growth. To just imagine that we can do it with a few policies here and there, would be, let's say, wouldn't be honest of myself to present it this way, right? We know points that they can be of leverages, and one point of leverages can be working policy, and especially around working hours. Another one could be around basic income, and another one could be about changing the taxation and the investment policies. These are policies that some progressive, advanced green parties have in their agenda, and I'm happy that they have it in their agenda, because we are part of the people who develop the discourses that they are part of their agenda. And the green parties in Europe, perhaps less visibilized by the media, but they are as big and as growing in some countries as the fascist right. Now, the fact that the fascist right is growing in response to the type of problems we are identifying doesn't mean anything for me. So what does this mean? Should we stop saying what we are saying or what we think it's true because the fascists are rising and they're getting angry with it? I didn't understand Ted's point. I mean, for me, what I'm presenting here, and I know I might be wrong, okay, but first and foremost, I see myself, or I started and I saw myself as a scientist, and I present what I see as some basic facts about growth and the way this idea of growth, let's say the reasonable consistency of this idea of growth, I see it as a basic fact. And I see a lot of other evidence that corresponds to what we in ecological economics have argued are the problems with growth. So if I see these facts, I have to recognize these facts. I'm not going to change my view of the facts because some conservatives do not like these facts, or some fascists are getting angry when they hear these facts. So the facts are the facts. Then we can think about the political strategies we might use in order to mobilize people in ways that we think are compatible with what we see as the facts. But I cannot change my view of the facts because of the political impossibility of, for example, stopping growth. On the same token, if you were someone arguing that the earth moves around back in the day, the kings would tell you, we're gonna cut your throat if you keep saying that the earth moves around. And then you would say, okay, I have to say something that the kings can accept, and be convinced about. So I understand political strategy, and I think Ted has a political strategy that he can be open about it. He was open about it when he was writing the breakthrough books, and it's not a secret. So he can be open about his political strategy and discuss the merits of the different political strategies, I think, and whether they make sense given how we interpret the facts, because I think we also interpret the facts quite differently, right? And I think this is part of epistemic humility, to accept that the facts are too complex to know. But the question I think was important, and we shouldn't avoid the question whether our visions, and I don't think this question applies only to Ted's vision, which I think is quite West-centered, and of course it is West-centered. It is developed in the West, and it is replicating the model of development, but it's a very Western model of development, practiced and inspired during capitalism. So of course it is Western. It didn't come from India, this idea of modernization of development. Of course, we can defend this Western model of development, and I think Ted defends it. So it's not, I don't think it for him is an insult to say that this model is Western. For me, I would say that yes, it is Western because we developed it, especially in Southern Europe, this idea of degrowth, and we are very cautious with it. So we don't want to expand it or say that this idea of degrowth should apply everywhere, and it's a model for the whole of the world, or we're having a big global vision. And this is why I differ a lot from the eco-modernist vision. I would never dare to write these big picture stories about nuclear power, it's going to do this, agricultural identification is going to do that for the world as a whole. I think it's too complex to say what could happen on the world as a whole. What I want to point is the problem, and then open a debate. The degrowth discourse, I think, is at least a little bit more open to views from the rest of the world, in the sense that the main view that right now is dominating the rest of the world is the idea of Western development, of Westernization. So by degrowth, we are confronting in the home of this idea, and we are saying, no, not Westernized development for the rest of the world. Let the rest of the world find their own paths to development, to well-being, or to whatever it is. So in that sense, yes, I take the criticism that we are Western-centered, but we are Western-centered because we think the problem is in the West.
And Giorgos, I think we might want to move on to another question. Thanks for that response. And
My apologies.
I can't hear the public, I'm sorry. So I don't know what's going on, so I'm sorry for that.
Oh, sorry.
Hello, Giorgos, can you hear me? I don't know if can you hear me, Giorgos?
Yes, I can hear.
Yeah, the comment was that some of the comments that were made by Ted were in the last round of questions were upsetting for some people in this room. That was the comment.
Okay, thank you.
So I'd like to ask a question now about potential unintended consequences. So obviously, Ted has the perspective of an eco-modernist future. Giorgos is looking at a degrowth future. If you were to kind of extrapolate 50 or 100 years into the future, and you've achieved the vision that you imagine for society, what kind of keeps you up at night? What are some potential unintended consequences of pursuing your particular vision? Is there anything where you think, oh, I really hope that we can achieve this, but I hope it doesn't happen in such a way that this also happens?
It's a good question. On one level, I think there are lots of ways that, one can imagine sort of, first of all, that, I think, to the point about epistemic humility, we almost always get the future wrong. And often, the way that we usually get it wrong is that the things that we worry about turn out not to be that big a deal, and there's other things that are much more serious that no one paid any attention to. I worry that, I actually worry about that, about a lot of the discussion around climate change, where I think there's a whole lot of other, really, really serious risks, from pandemics to just wars to, there's a lot that can go wrong in all sorts of ways. And you know, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how well we're going to be able to adapt to climate change. So, you know, just one thing, you know, not just for my my vision, but just sort of a set of the problems I'm concerned about, you know, may not turn out to be that big a deal. I think you can also you know, you can look at those population trends, and there's all sorts of ways, and a lot of people raising concerns about, you know, a world that is depopulating, where you're seeing falling population, and I think there's a lot of, you know, potential consequences associated with that. So, you know, those are, you know, I think that in some ways the sort of more, to me, interesting question is just not sort of what are all the unintended consequences and things that could go wrong with your normative vision, but what are all the things that could go wrong on the way to it, in pursuit of it? Where are the ways in which you know, that idea might kind of go off the rails in a bunch of different ways? And you know, certainly, you know, I mean, I think the biggest thing, and frankly, I think it's a challenge to both the degrowth and the eco-modernist visions, is just, you know, they sort of both assume some capacity of sort of democratic societies to actually sort of make decisions and plan for the future. And I got, you know, I think there's a bunch of reasons to think that as we become, you know, both more affluent and more democratic, it actually gets harder and harder. And I think, you know, from a sort of the perspective of a lot of folks who have deep egalitarian values, the problems that democracies have are always going to, the answer is always more democracy, you know, more egalitarianism. And I think you can kind of look at a lot of what's going on in the world right now and go, well, maybe not so much. So, I mean, the things that I worry more about, whether you're trying to get to a degrown future or an eco-modern future, is just our capacity institutionally and politically to kind of sustain any kind of sort of planned response to these and a whole lot of other challenges.
Right. Giorgos, any response to unintended consequences?
Yeah, I think we have to be clear with what these visions that we're creating are meant to do. Like, I never understood like the proposal of a vision of degrowth as like being a blueprint, or as ever having like the pretension or the belief that what I'm proposing could happen, you know, the way it is proposed. So that's why I emphasize the point of critique. But at the point of the proposal, I think these visions, what they do is that they shape the future. They shape the future as part of different dialogues, you know, and they are floating around and they are taken up by people in ways that we can never imagine. So in that sense, I think that the utopias or the positive views of the future we provide, especially the degrowth one, would never be implemented or come to fruition as such. The question is like, what could come up nourished by this vision or nourished by this critique, or what openings that we can't predict right now, precisely because we can't predict the future, could emerge if people accepted the critique of growth and capitalism and acted on it, you know, but along the lines of what we are discussing. So that's one important question. The second is, what could go wrong, let's say, if the economies were to decline, which is not degrowth, precisely because we try to keep the term degrowth to mean a positive view of such a transformation, right? And not an unplanned, uncontrolled, or a continuous recession or Great Depression. But of course, there is the possibility that economies can, and apologies for using now the word degrow in the wrong way, but that economies decline, no? And that this happens uncontrollably, or happens with islands of where growth is continuous and is protected, let's say more powerful countries like the US, and then the rest of the world is facing continuous recession. So there is the possibility of this happening, and this can be a very bad outcome if social relations and institutions remain the way they are. We know that if there is no growth and capitalism continues to operate, we have more and more wealth accumulating at the hands of the few, unless there is some form of redistribution. So this can be a very bad outcome. We can have a much worse outcome with a much smaller economy, and I would never deny that. So that's one thing that can go bad. The other thing that can go bad is that people may appropriate people with which we may not agree may partly appropriate these ideas for very different political projects than the ones they are intended and presented when we talk about the growth. So I can very well imagine, but this is not happening. It was an initial concern that far-right or xenophobic groups could selectively, and this happened in France 10 years ago, but could selectively take some part of the growth to argue for closed borders, for lower population within the country, for more economic sufficiency of the nation, putting the nation first, its important values, and not the pursuit of the economy, etc. So, of course, these ideas can get a very bad direction, as all ideas can get a bad direction, and as all, even the most progressive ideas in the past have taken very bad directions, no? This was one concern, but right now, let's say if we read the political map, we can't be concerned anymore with that, because the far right is right now identifying itself as a denier of any need to do anything about the environment. So this discourse is left completely. I'm not worried that much. But of course, there is always the worry how discourses around the growth and limits to growth could be used by neoliberal political interests to justify policies of austerity. Again, we have to be, those of us who argue about the growth from a particular perspective and with a particular vision, have to refine and reframe and present the idea in a way that it's not assimilable with arguments like that. And again, I have to say that if we look at actual neoliberal politics right now, they are all pursued and justified in the name of growth. So very rarely you would find an argument made in the name of limits to growth. But if I was to say, to imagine a scenario of the growth gone wrong would be like appropriated by neoliberal interests to justify a more and more unequal world that we have in the future as the economy cannot grow, which is a scenario Ted raised. He raised it as a natural and quite smooth post-material transition. But I think if this happens within capitalism, the way capitalism works right now, it will be far of smooth and post-material. It will actually be quite conflictuous and quite problematic.
Thanks. Okay, so I think we're a little bit behind time, but do we have time for one more question? Okay. So Ted Nordhaus's future is much more optimistic for my children's future. Degrowth may mean less access to healthcare, education, other progressive institutions. Is there a possibility for a high-tech nuclear degrowth future? Otherwise, why would millennials have kids?
I mean, I think it's interesting, and I'll just kind of go back to, like, when Giorgos talks about what his, the sort of policies in the actual agenda, it just looks like social democracy to me. It's a universal basic income. It's a carbon tax. I can go back to California and go into Silicon Valley. I can find people advocating every one of those things, and many people advocating all of them without any particular arguments about growth or degrowth or anything else. So when you kind of get to, if you look at the history of successful nuclear energy, it's really mostly been in sort of fairly strong social democratic context in France and Sweden. Really the biggest successes. I mean, it's a socialist technology. It's actually, the markets are the problem for nuclear when you start to get to liberalized economic markets, decentralized, decentralization of energy sources. You get into contexts where it's much harder to do long-term planning for infrastructure and things like that. I mean, if you really were like, whether it's degrown or just sort of a more sort of social democratic vision where the state, more of basic goods and services are provided directly by the public sector, nuclear is a pretty great technology for that. So sure, absolutely, I think you can do, and interestingly, if you look at the sort of, go back and look at the sort of all of the literature underlying the sort of vision for sort of renewable energy and a renewable energy future, it was really quite anti-statist. It was It was really an argument for against institutions and against bureaucracy and against a bunch of the things that I think, a lot of folks, even on the left are now kind of looking back to that sort of post-war era where we had mixed economies and we had much more robust sort of state management of the economy and kind of going, we want more of that. And really the kind of soft energy vision was a pretty explicit attack on those institutions. I've argued that there's sort of two paths for nuclear, and one is more market and private sector driven, which requires a lot more innovation, and the other is more sort of state-led and sort of mixed economy, and just, if we just saw public clean energy as a public good, like we see like clean water and things like that, you just go nationalize the power sector and go build a lot of you just Gen 2, 3 nuclear plants, big infrastructure, which when you do it that way, you can do it pretty fast and pretty efficiently. So I see no kind of contradiction between those two things. Now, when you go to like really radically shrinking economies, and I think even Giorgos recognizes that there's sort of questions about how you balance that sort of degrowth with the kind of sort of investment in infrastructure of one sort or another that's necessary to sort of deeply decarbonize even much smaller economies. So
Right. So, Giorgos, do you think that there is a potential for a high-tech nuclear degrowth future?
No, but let me. I mean, it's not part of the vision I have about the growth. Whether there is a potential future or not remains to be seen. But let me just say that I don't think it's I don't see my vision as pessimistic and Ted's as optimistic. I mean, I'm sure Ted sees his vision as optimistic, but I also see my vision as optimistic. I would feel very down, which means pessimistic, if the world that Ted imagines was the world that I would inherit to my children. So it's not the world that I desire. Like the photos that they use in the Eco-modernist manifesto to say, okay, that's what a modern future, eco-modern future would look like, do not appeal to me, which doesn't mean that they are not right. No, they appeal to Ted, they might appeal to other people, but it's not the future that I imagine. If the future that I imagine and we write about the growth, a more simple, more frugal, more sufficient future, forget now whether it's possible or not, no? But if this future was to happen and there was going to be like a social transformation, a social revolution to change the way capitalism works, this for me is like optimistic. That's like a future I would like. And of course, I would like to have kids to live through this future that I didn't live. So I don't understand this definition of like, just because we're gonna have robots and rockets and big nuclear power, that's optimistic. It's optimistic for what type of desire about the future? Not for mine, for sure. The second one, Ted mentioned it as a negative thing that many of the proposals we mentioned are also part of general social democracy or even discussed in Silicon Valley. I wouldn't say that it's bad. I mean, precisely following his own political strategies, which is try to promote policies that he thinks there can be alliances and coalitions around them, I think that's a very good starting point, that many more people, for other reasons, might agree with the same policies that we advocate in the name of degrowth. But we see them as part of a different package. We see them as revolutionary reforms, we call them. Reforms that if they were to happen, like a basic income or a reduction of the working week, would bring a very much more systematic transformation of the system than even perhaps the Silicon Valley types who support them realize. This would be a transformation in the right direction. Now, of course, if these reforms were to take place without the ecological part of our proposals, without the ecological taxation, without limits, without legislation for the environment, etc., of course, they would be perhaps a social democracy of growth, that it wouldn't be a social democracy or, let's say, a socialist degrowth. But we put them in a different package. So they might be the same proposals, but I think that's the strength of our proposals rather than a weakness. About nuclear, I mean, I have specific problems with nuclear as a form of power that we can discuss, and I'm sure that we're going to have then thousands of tweets from Michael Schellenberger telling me that I got it wrong, and then his friends around are going to start also tweeting, and I will have to start blocking them. But I don't want to go in this direction. What I want to say is like whether nuclear power, the way nuclear power is envisioned, is in line with what we talk about as a vision of degrowth. And again, you might argue whether degrowth is the right vision or not, but I don't think it's compatible. And I don't think it's compatible for two reasons. Because, first of all, it requires a quite centralized and big structure, while degrowth has also, yes, a strong state that makes reforms, but that it's also decentralizing. So I'm really worried about this conflict between these big centralized technological infrastructures that depend on experts and the decentralized future. Although I know there are people like Paul Robbins that argue that the two might be compatible, but I would really question that the idea of district level or decentralized nuclear, given the safety concerns we have about nuclear. And that's my second problem. I think nuclear power is, again, I feel, is like dropping a little bit the count down the line. So we create another source of energy that's going to come with huge problems in the future, from dealing with waste, etc., etc. Ted could answer and now tell me that none of these concerns are really strong, and he could very well do it. No, so again, it's not the fact so much, but I'm expressing what is my concern. My concern is like that we're building something huge, which rests on a assumption that this society will keep going and growing the way it does and handling more and more complex infrastructure. When I see this infinite compound growth curves going up, I know that this cannot be the future. So I'm trying to think what sort of energy technology would be manageable and will be less risky in the future. Building like nuclear power plants around at the scale that would be necessary to reduce carbon emissions seems to be, to me, a very risky bet. Like we would be solving, if we were to solve and not just add more energy, we would be solving one problem, climate change, by creating another one for future generations. So that's why I'm personally, I wouldn't put nuclear as part of the degrowth future.
Okay, thanks. And thanks to everyone else who submitted questions. Sorry, we had to wrap up a little early. We started a little after time, and now I know we've gone overtime. So thanks to Ted Nordhaus and Giorgos Kallis for being with us today, and for everybody attending in the audience.
Thank you.